The Supreme Court of the United States has been in the news a lot over the last few years for a wide variety of reasons. This got us to thinking that maybe an examination of the court during the Cold War period would be in order. And of the multitude of various topics within the history of the court, it's easy to identify the Warren Court as being perhaps one of the most transformative, yet controversial periods in US legal history. I'm your host David, and today we are going to examine the Warren Court, not just for some of its key rulings, but its place in challenging the role of the Supreme Court in the US government system. This is the Cold War. Okay, so lasting from 1953 to 1969, the Warren Court, so named as it was led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, is often celebrated for its progressive rulings. However, it also sparked significant controversy for its judicial activism. During this period, the Supreme Court expanded civil rights and liberties in unprecedented ways, but it was also an anomaly in the broader history of the traditional conservative institution. So, let's take a look. To understand the Warren Court's significance, it's important to remember that events and actions never take place in a vacuum. And in this case, we first need to consider the global context. The court's progressive rulings were not just about domestic reform. They had an international dimension, deeply entwined with the Cold War. During the 1950s and 1960s, the United States was in fierce competition with the Soviet Union, not only militarily and politically, but as we all know, ideologically as well. Both superpowers claimed to represent the superior societal model, democracy versus communism. And one area in which the United States was vulnerable to Soviet criticism was racial segregation and the systemic inequality that persisted within its own democracy. Soviet propaganda frequently highlighted America's racial discrimination and civil rights abuses as evidence of its hypocrisy. This criticism had real consequences, especially as the US sought to win the favor of newly independent nations across Africa and Asia, many of which were skeptical of Western democracy due to their own colonial pasts. The Warren Court's rulings, particularly in 1954's Brown v. Board of Education, had profound global implications. Brown overturned the infamous 1896 decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, which had upheld the separate but equal doctrine was constitutional and effectively legalized racial segregation in America. By declaring segregation in public schools unconstitutional, the Warren Court signaled a major shift. This wasn't just a legal milestone, it was also a crucial movement for US diplomacy during the Cold War. By addressing racial inequality, the United States could better present itself as a moral leader on the world stage, countering Soviet accusations of hypocrisy. The Warren Court's actions bolstered America's credibility as a defender of democracy and human rights, helping to sway the ideological battle in the Cold War's broader geopolitical theater. So, how did this court come about? Well, the Warren Court did not become an activist institution by accident, especially considering how it was shaped by the personalities and beliefs of the justices who sat on the bench. At the center of this transformation was Chief Justice Earl Warren, appointed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1953. Eisenhower believed Warren would be a moderate, perhaps even conservative voice on the court. However, Warren quickly surprised him and the nation by leading a series of rulings that reshaped American law and society. Warren's background as the governor of California, an office he was elected to after filing papers with both the Republican and Democratic parties in the state, provided him with an understanding of social issues that would later influence his judicial philosophy. Under his leadership, the court became a vehicle for addressing systemic inequalities and injustice. Warren was not content with following narrow interpretations of the law. He believed the judiciary should actively promote social fairness. As such, his tenure as Chief Justice remains one of the most influential in Supreme Court history. We will come back to that shortly. Also sitting on the bench with Warren, although closer to the end of the Warren Court, was another pivotal figure, Thurgood Marshall. Marshall had been the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the lead attorney in the landmark Brown v. Board of Education case. His argument before the court are what helped dismantle the legal foundations of racial segregation, obviously making him one of the most important figures in the civil rights movement. His subsequent appointment to the Supreme Court in 1967, the first African American to serve on the court, further cemented his legacy. Marshall's contributions to civil rights law, both as an advocate and later as a justice, were pivotal in shaping the court's progressive trajectory. These two figures, along with other key justices like William Brennan and Hugo Black, fundamentally redefined the role of the judiciary. They believed that the court should be an agent of change, breaking from its historical pattern of judicial restraint. And while the Warren Court's decisions were hailed by many as progressive triumphs, they also ignited fierce opposition. Conservatives viewed the court rulings as overreach, accusing it of engaging in judicial activism, creating new rights and policies rather than simply interpreting the law. These critiques were most vocal in response to the court's rulings on civil rights, criminal justice reform, and the separation of church and state. One of the most significant examples of resistance occurred after the court's decision in the aforementioned Brown v. Board of Education. Southern states responded with what became known as massive resistance. Governors like George Wallace of Alabama famously declared their intent to defy federal desegregation orders. In some cases, state legislatures passed laws designed to circumvent the court's rulings, and public schools were shut down to avoid integration. At the grassroots level, conservative movements also mobilized against the Warren Court's decisions. Emerging conservative legal organizations, such as the Federalist Society, founded in 1892 but firmly rooted in the earlier conservative reactions to Warren-era rulings, sought to develop legal arguments that would counter the court's progressive decisions. These organizations laid the foundation for the conservative shift seen in later courts, such as those under Chief Justices William Rehnquist and John Roberts. We should be clear here, though, the backlash wasn't just limited to civil rights cases. 1966's Miranda v. Arizona, which required police to inform suspects of their rights, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, and so on from what you always hear in American cop shows. Miranda was another ruling that provoked controversy, as critics argued that it hamstrung law enforcement, giving too many protections to criminals at the expense of public safety. Similarly, Engel v. Vitale in 1962, which prohibited state-sponsored prayer in public schools, was decried by religious conservatives as an attack on the nation's moral fabric. The Warren Court's decisions on criminal justice and religious freedom reflected its broader commitment to protecting individual rights, but these decisions also deepened the divide between supporters and opponents of judicial activism. So, what do we mean by judicial activism? Well, to understand the dramatic nature of the Warren Court's shift, it's important to look at the court's history before Warren's tenure. For much of its history, the Supreme Court acted as a conservative institution, often defending the status quo and prioritizing the protection of business interests over individual rights. Consider, for example, the notable example of Lochner v. New York in 1905, where the court struck down a New York law limiting the working hours of bakers. The court ruled that the law interfered with the freedom of contract between employers and employees, symbolizing its commitment to laissez-faire economics and its reluctance to allow government intervention in business affairs. This case typified the court's conservative philosophy, one that viewed economic freedom as sacrosanct, often at the expense of workers' rights. Similarly, in 1896's Plessy v. Ferguson, the court upheld racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine, maintaining the legal framework for Jim Crow laws. This ruling allowed racial inequality to flourish for nearly 6 decades before it was overturned by the Warren Court in Brown v. Board of Education. The decision in Plessy epitomized the court's earlier reluctance to challenge societal norms, even when those norms were discriminatory and unjust. The Warren Court's willingness to challenge entrenched power structures and promote social justice represented a dramatic break from this tradition of judicial conservatism. So, central to the legacy of the Warren Court is the philosophical debate between judicial restraint and judicial activism. Judicial restraint, which had historically guided the court, holds that courts should defer to the decisions of elected lawmakers and intervene only in cases of clear constitutional violations. This approach limits the role of the judiciary, requiring them to interpret existing law rather than create new policies. The Warren Court, however, embraced judicial activism, the belief that the courts should play a proactive role in addressing societal issues, especially when other branches of government fail to protect individual rights. This philosophy was evident in cases like Miranda versus Arizona, where the court established that police must inform suspects of their rights during an arrest, and Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963, which guaranteed the right to legal counsel for defendants who could not afford an attorney. Critics of judicial activism, particularly conservatives, argue that the court was overstepping its authority and infringing on the democratic process. They believed that the judiciary should not be creating new rights or expanding old ones, as these decisions were better left to elected officials. However, supporters of the Warren Court contended that judicial activism was necessary to protect the rights of marginalized groups, particularly when these groups had little influence in the political system. After all, how do you elect an official to enact change if your vote is being suppressed, for example? The philosophical divide between judicial restraint and activism remains a key debate in American jurisprudence, and the Warren Court's legacy continues to influence how both liberals and conservatives view the role of the judiciary. Following Warren's retirement in 1969, the court gradually returned to a more restrained role, particularly under the leadership of Chief Justice Warren E. Burger and later Chief Justice William Rehnquist. These courts adopted a more conservative judicial philosophy, often curbing the reach of the Warren Court's rulings, particularly in the areas of criminal justice and federalism. The Warren Court was a remarkable period in U.S. legal history. It was one in which the Supreme Court stepped out of its traditional role as a passive arbiter of laws and became an active agent of social change. Its decisions on civil rights, criminal justice, and individual liberties had profound and lasting impacts, shaping the course of American society for decades to come. But while this era of judicial activism is often celebrated, it's important to remember that it was an outlier. For much of its history, the Supreme Court has been a more conservative institution, reluctant to challenge existing power structures and slow to embrace social change. While the Warren Court faced significant opposition during its time, its rulings have had a lasting impact on American law and society. One of the court's most enduring contributions was its expansion of privacy rights, particularly in 1965 with Griswold versus Connecticut, which struck down a state law that banned the use of contraceptives by married couples. Griswold was significant because it established a constitutional right to privacy, even though privacy itself is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. This ruling laid the groundwork for subsequent landmark cases, most notably 1973's Roe v. Wade, which extended privacy rights to a woman's right to choose to have an abortion. The Warren Court's decisions on civil rights also had a profound and lasting effect. Brown v. Board of Education became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement, leading to further legislative reforms, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws helped dismantle segregation and ensured greater voting rights protections for African Americans. Although these decisions were met with significant resistance at the time, they helped set the stage for a broader cultural shift towards greater racial equality. Regarding criminal justice, the Warren Court's rulings reshaped how the legal system interacts with suspects and defendants. Miranda versus Arizona and Gideon versus Wainwright remain pillars of criminal procedure in the United States, with Miranda rights now an essential part of law enforcement practices. Despite continued criticism, these rulings are widely regarded as necessary safeguards to protect individual rights in an often imbalanced system of justice. The long-term legacy of this era of Supreme Court is not limited to its specific rulings. Its embrace of judicial activism redefined the court's role, inspiring future generations of justices and legal scholars to think of the judiciary as a force for social progress. Even as later courts, particularly under Chief Justices William Rehnquist and John Roberts, have scaled back or overturned some Warren Court decisions, the precedent of judicial intervention in cases of profound societal importance endures. In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King told us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. A statement made towards the end of the Warren Court, but one firmly rooted in the decisions it had laid out. Well, this statement is one of hope. As we look at the ongoing history of the court, it should serve as a reminder that nothing is inevitable and justice must be fought for. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have, in an 8-to-1 decision, press the bell button to ensure that you continue to get notifications when something new drops. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.